So this is the first of several roundtables here at MPRG 2024, the Consortium on Moral Decision Making. The goal of these is just to basically have some conversations about topics in philosophy and psychology and see some interesting points of overlap. So we have Brett Karlan, philosophy from Purdue, Anna Gantman, a psychologist from CUNY Brooklyn, Paul Davies, philosopher from College William & Mary, and Daniel Kelly from Purdue University, philosophy. And so I thought just to kind of get the conversation going, is there anything particularly exciting that each of you see in how the field of moral psychology is going, particularly in its conversations with moral philosophy?
Yes. So one of the things I'm sort of most excited about, and not coincidentally I'm also working on, is ways that moral psychology and what we're learning about how people actually make moral decisions can be used to, like, applications of it basically can be used to operationalize ways we might, push people to be more moral or shape social outcomes or, like, usher in, like, not just understand social change and moral progress, but kind of help steer it and guide it in various ways. And so if you think of, philosophers have been thinking about the right kinds of ideals or outcomes for a long time, and not having much to say about how to get there from here. I think moral psychology and more people are starting to get interested, and I know Anna's been working on this as well. Like, okay, given the way that our minds work, how can we get going in that direction, maybe a little bit quicker?
Yeah, and any people feel free to jump in too, like if you see points of connection as well.
Yeah. So I'll just say at this conference, some really nice papers about social norms, children internalizing social norms, and that plugs into theories of cultural evolution that I've recently been teaching, and that seems to me to be a really fecund framework for moral psychology.
Sure.
After you.
Yeah, I see lots of points of connection. One, I think, exciting direction is that we're starting to acknowledge the good and the bad of moral psychology. So, right, the word moral has this double meaning. We sometimes mean moral relevance, we sometimes mean moral goodness, and I think as a field we're starting to see some of the good and some of the bad that moral cognition can do, because it's kind of black and white. It leads us to think that our ideas are objective, and sometimes that can create conflict, and I think that some of the interventions that you're maybe thinking about are both to make people more moral and also maybe do that by making them think a little bit less in a moral way. I think that's an interesting direction that things are going. And I agree that this cultural evolution framework is so interesting. I'm really interested in institutions and how people interact with official rules in addition to social norms, and I think that that framework is really helpful for thinking about those distinctions.
Oh, we're just going in a circle. Good.
Yeah.
Good. So I'm a little bit more of an outsider, I think, than the other people at this table. So what I see most obviously being most relevant from, like, the stuff I've been hearing, conversations we've been having, is like, especially surrounding issues like, I'm going to say the word AI, right? And interaction. Like, sorry, I know it's one of the things I work on, so I'm just going to say the word. I think that there are a lot of philosophers who are very interested in sort of moral, normative, but also just like social norm style questions about, like, when and how the proper use of these technologies, like what they look like. And, this is not a criticism. I've published stuff like this too. Like, I think that oftentimes we can do in this context exactly what Dan was saying. We can kind of like try to think about, well, in an ideal scenario, what would the norms surrounding the use of this particular technology look like? How could we maximize the epistemic benefit of that technology? How could we maximize or minimize, maximize would be crazy, minimize the harm that these technologies sort of bring about, right? That's often the question that philosophers in the more like theoretical mode work on. But obviously there needs to be a bridge between, like, well, here's how we actually are doing things right now. How do we get from that to, like, a slightly better world? I think that, like, the moral psych and the norm psychology stuff more broadly has a lot of interesting things to say, both to tell us, like, well, you can say these things about this ideal, about how to act in this particular context, but one, how do people actually think about it? And two, how can we, intervene in certain ways to get them to think slightly differently? Those are kinds of questions that I don't think, like, my philosophy friends can just tell me a priori, right? So that's like a real intersection between those two fields. Yeah.
It's really interesting with AI, especially as you've given a talk here on AI empathy before.
Yep.
I mean, how explicit we are about talking about morality as such when we interact with like ChatGPT or something. And I think I'm trying to think of how it connects to what you were saying in terms of how obvious to make discussions of morality and moral norms and how they change within our culture. Like, what is our role as scientists, as philosophers, in trying to cultivate those explicit conversations?
I mean, yeah, it's really interesting, right? Because I think that and totally in line with your point, I think that like overly moralizing this, we have good evidence that it doesn't really work, right? Like just telling somebody who's like quite lonely and wants to use one of these replica style AI chatbots, telling them about all of the like ways that this might be wrong, I don't think changes anybody's real behavior of like loading that thing up at the end of the day when they just want somebody in air quotes to talk to, right? So I don't think an overly moralistic framework is going to be very helpful. I don't have data on that because I don't collect data, but you know, I don't think, it doesn't seem anecdotally at least that that's going to be really helpful.
There's good reason to think it could cause some backlash
Yep.
or reactance,
Yep.
right? People don't really like being told that the things that they want are morally wrong.
Yep.
And it makes me wonder too, I mean, kind of to some of your work, Evan Wester, on effort and norm change. I mean, with that specific lane and usage, like how people would think about and try to cognize and have difficulty thinking about this ever-changing normative landscape about how we interact with AI. I just wonder how some of your work on effort and norm change might relate to some of this.
Yeah, I mean, you say some of our work. We've got like one little Eon magazine article on that. We're going to work on it more, certainly. But yeah, I think like understanding the ways that people cognize norms and the factors that are going to make them resistant or receptive to like dropping an old one and adopting a new one. That's the sort of thing that if you're someone who's interested in, again, ushering in norm change, or if you're a norm entrepreneur, as the terminology goes these days.
That's the terminology.
Norm entrepreneur is definitely what there's all the fun lingo out there.
That's great.
You can kind of game plan better if you know what the landscape's going to be like. So the norm psychology stuff allows you to think a little bit about how, you know, individuals, given their social identities, might respond to various interventions. But another thing I like about the norm psychology stuff is it's a really nice connection between like the psychological machinery that's in any one individual's head and the way that is like just directly connected up to all these social factors and institutional factors. And so it starts to erode this very easy binary that people can fall into when they're thinking about social change. Whereas we either need to change the individuals or we need to change the structures, and it's this like binary choice. But I think part of what a lot of the interesting stuff in moral psychology is doing now, especially with the scaffolding of this cultural evolutionary framework, is it's just starting to complicate that in ways which we don't fully understand yet, but can totally harness once we start to understand it more and more.
This is just a hunch, but when I teach classes on morality, my guess is that the cultural evolutionary framework will, and some of the talks here, will at least suggest that oftentimes when we're moralizing, when we're moralizing, we're oftentimes conflating, say, culture-specific legal norms that we're mistaken as moral norms, or maybe even, I don't know, aesthetic norms, or something specific to one's family or lineage or something like that. So I think teasing those things apart and very much resisting the instinct that, at least in my home institution, I sense sometimes people are very quick to moralize before they really understand.
Yep.
Yeah.
And what I think is fantastic about the work that people here are doing is trying to understand it.
It's a thin line to walk, though, right? Because at least in my field, where there's, you know, billions and billions of dollars of vested interest of like this technology being something that's life changing, right? Like it can also be like difficult to not just have, I think, the correct knee-jerk reaction of like, this seems bad across a number of different dimensions. So it's a fine line between like, we want to understand like, and open-mindedly understand how people are using this technology and how norms are changing. But at the same time, we want to be able to like hold on to like what I think of as mostly correct normative judgments about these kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about. Presumably people are going to expect some kind of regulation.
Yeah.
to come. And I think part of what you're saying is thinking about how individual norms are interacting with then norms that we codify in institutions and whether we make them legal or not, which has huge implications for punishment, right? So thinking about norm change, if interpersonally, I think the way that you're using AI is weird, maybe you feel judged by me, but that's really different than the way that you're using AI is illegal. And now like the arm of the state can tell you how weird the thing that you're doing is, and that's really different.
Hate when the state calls me weird.
Yeah, right, because they do it with force.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think like building off that, and to close our discussion. So I remember, Dan, when you visited here back in 2017 for the first MPRG, we had a conversation with Natalia Washington and Steve Stitch about interdisciplinary approaches and the relationship between science and ethics. And I'm just curious, in the time since, it's been about 7 years, lots changed in psychology and I would assume philosophy as well. How do you, where do you see the relationship between these fields? Like, how do you see them as informing each other? Like, what does it mean we were having this conversation trying to kind of riff off each other and think about how these things intersect. But as you're thinking about the relationship between those fields, the normative and the psychological kind of evolved?
I think maybe the focal point for me has changed, whereas before I was thinking more about how to, what we could do to get philosophers and psychologists and anthropologists and people in business schools to be able to communicate with each other a little bit more, sort of, in the trenches of the professions, and how to rearrange incentives so that we reward people for doing this sort of thing and can set up conferences like this one, which is wonderfully interdisciplinary. The way I've been thinking about it recently is that so there's a picture of what human moral nature is that's kind of coalescing, and again supplemented with the cultural evolutionary perspective, gives us a picture of humans which is we're just radically social. We're such outliers in the natural world, and the way our minds work is that we're extremely interdependent on each other. But then we have this image in the folk image of what human nature is like, and the folk image of what morality is like, which is distinct from what normative ethicists do, where they're thinking very carefully with some jargon about the proper ideals. But then there's just kind of folk morality. And that the way folk morality and this emerging picture of humans is super social, I think they're starting to come into more and more conflict with each other. And even if you want to do the thing that I was talking about earlier, which is help kind of usher in change in the right direction, you got to wrangle with this, not just the facts of how we actually are, but how everyone thinks we are, because get the scientific picture to inform the folk theory and the manifest image picture a little bit more. And that's a project that we all have to be involved in one way or another. And we're all kind of indirectly contributing it too. But I've been thinking about that more sort of explicitly lately.
I think I'll just echo what Dan said. It shows up, I think, mainly in my teaching that, I think there's something just deeply conservative about academic philosophy. We inherit these conceptual categories from pre-Darwinian times. We have conceptual categories that go back to Descartes and Hobbes and, even the ancient Greece. So methodologically, when I'm discussing with students what we're reading, theories of cultural evolution, say, and trying to apply it to understanding, what is Kant saying, or what should we make of what Kant had to say about morality. A good bit of it is I suppose we could bring Kant back to life, and he was apprised of the scientific theories that we know today. I think there's a good bit that he would say, "Oh God, I didn't realize how wrong I was," right?
Couldn't you do that with ChatGPT? Isn't that a feeding corpus of text?
The Kant bot?
Based upon
Brilliant. Yeah, actually.
trademark that immediately.
But all that.
Don't do that. Don't do that. It's bad.
But all that is to say is, I think, not just culturally, but even in academic philosophy, I think there's a deep conceptual conservatism, and I think bringing reliable scientific knowledge to bear is absolutely essential. I think otherwise, it's not just idle or perhaps a waste of time. I think it's just perpetuating presumptions about what we are that a good many people have figured out aren't true yet.
Yeah, no, I love that.
Yeah, I think that I love what both of you are saying, and I think one piece of it, and we heard this great talk about gender earlier, is that so much of what makes humans so social is this kind of parental care, alloparental care, and this idea of what human morality is like is so tied up in care, and we are, I think, starting to understand and acknowledge that more and more, but it's not a very masculine idea of what humans are like, and so that's an interesting piece.
I'm like 95% inclined to agree with everything that's gone on. But like,
What's your 5%?
Here's the 5%. The 5% is just a positive spin on like the slightly more negative spin of this earlier. Is that like, I mean, 2017, I was in grad school. I don't know what the hell was going on. But one thing that I really like about these kinds of interdisciplinary debates, conversations, whatever, is precisely that the actual, at least to me, the thing that it dissolves is this idea that the intellectual fields that we've carved out have their own like unique method that only they can do, and that's the proper function of a philosopher, the proper function of a psychologist. Like there might be some things that the philosopher is better at, but a significant amount of philosophy involves more or less empirical claims about the way that the mind works. And so you need somebody to come in and tell, and we focus on that a lot. But also, quite a lot of psychology really needs like good theory to interpret the data and to understand like how, studies 1 through 3 can get stitched together into like a bigger, more comprehensible narrative, and philosophers can really help out with that.
Yeah.
So like by blowing up the kind of conservative philosophical tradition, it also frees up philosophers to go and do the thing that philosophers are good at in other fields and raise the epistemic status of both of those fields. That's the part I like.
Yes, I agree with that so much, especially when I think about myself doing peer review. I can feel that the methods and analytic level critiques are really sticky.
Yeah.
And sometimes the conceptual level critiques can be easily kind of explained away, and then they don't make it into the final paper. And I think that the interdisciplinary conversations also can help psychologists and whoever collecting empirical data to be better at the kind of philosophical thinking that helps you integrate those conceptual arguments and like refining the concepts, because otherwise they sail right in.
Yeah, basically we just have
Yeah.
different training.
Yeah.
But we're all kind of doing the same thing.
Yeah.
And we can just help each other do it better, basically. Yeah.
Well, I think that's an excellent way to end. So thank you all for taking time to do this, the conference, and thanks for your time.
Thanks for
Yeah, thanks, Daryl.
My pleasure. Thank you, Daryl.